Hi, my name is Vanya Bogachev, and I am back with my study of the redwood ant Formica rufa at Iloranta Holiday Village. This time, in the summer of 2012, I am intending to do something which is crucial to my goal of spreading the ants over the territory of Iloranta. I am attempting to create an artificial ant nest. One of the methods of creating an artificial nest is to take from 50 to about 100 liters of the nest material of a large ant nest in early spring, when the ants, and most importantly the queens, crawl up to the surface of the nest to get warm after the long winter. Then you put this nest material on a stump of medium size, dry but not yet too rotten, ensuring that it is in direct sunlight for the first hours after the move. As the donor nest, I chose the largest ant nest on the territory of Iloranta, the twin. I undertook the operation at the beginning of May, when there was a huge cluster of ants on the surface of twin. Covered with a thick layer of protective clothing, I shoveled about 70 liters of twin's dome into a black garbage bag and put it in a bin with wheels. Next I wheeled the bin to Iloranta's larger island, where I had prepared a stump for the first artificial nest. This stump stands on a stony hillock right on the edge of the lake, and has access to a lot of sunlight during the afternoon. After some trouble with untying the bag, I dumped the future ant nest on this stump. I called this nest the Experimental Nest 1, E1 for short. To be on the safe side, I decided to make another artificial ant nest. This time the donor was the man-eater ant nest. The man-eater is one of the 3 ant nests I have found across the road from Iloranta. It is about half the size of twin and stands by a gravel road leading to some abandoned houses. I have not studied these outsider ant nests too closely, but as far as I could see, the man-eater has 3 foraging trails. I repeated the procedure I had with twin, taking only about 50 liters of the man-eater, and wheeled the bin over to another stump I had prepared. This stump is located on the south end of Iloranta on a slight hill in some fir trees. After dumping the contents of the bag onto this stump, I called this nest the Experimental 2, or E2. I had wanted to see what would happen inside the new ant nests, so before I undertook the resettlement operations, I cut away half of each stump and put a glass covered with cloth against the remaining half. But, as you will see, this did not work out. Later in the day of the move, I fed both E1 and E2 with bits of chicken and some breadcrumbs. The ants from both experimental nests obviously favored the chicken, although they did eat the bread too. I also put special feeders filled with sugar solution next to both E1 and E2. Soon the feeders close to both the nests were stuffed with ants. But the ants were not the only guests at this feast. As you can see, they themselves became courses for some of the diners. Both ant nests immediately began to collect building materials from the woods around them. I'm not sure that rebuilding the nest are the correct words in this case though. They were moving chaotically and very fast, and it didn't look like they had a general plan of what to do yet. Most ants were exploring the territory around their new homes. So ended the first day of the resettlement of E1 and E2. The next day after the resettlement, something new happened only in E1. The ants had organized a foraging trail onto a birch tree nearby. They were drinking the tree's juices at a small gash. Apart from this, the situation was much the same as the previous day. The ants were frantically scouring all around both E1 and E2, exploring the territory and gathering building materials. In E1, the ants were particularly concentrating on the rocky slope beneath their nest. From the food we left them the day before, the ants were mostly eating the chicken. Also, many were packed inside the feeders. The ants from E2 even began building around one of theirs. But 1 week after the move, something interesting developed in both E1 and E2. Ants from E1 had ebbed off the slope and moved their focus of interest to a clump of foxberry bushes nearby. They retained an active interest in the birch tree, from which they were still drinking juice. Meanwhile, the ants from E2 had decided to organize expeditions on a larger scale. A lot of them were crawling around a medium-sized stump about 2 or 3 meters away from their nest. Some were also spotted on a concrete slab about 6 meters away. Closer to home, at the foot of 2 large fir trees, there were 3 big clusters of ants. I'm not sure what they were doing there. I discovered that most of the food I had left a week ago had been eaten by dogs. This time I gave both E1 and E2 powdered dog biscuits. When next I inspected the experimental nests on the 1st of June, about 3 weeks after the resettlement, at first I was dismayed. There were no ants on or near either E1 or E2. But after looking closely at the surrounding grounds, I discovered the reason for their absence. They had moved by themselves. E1 had relocated to the clump of foxberry bushes where I had spotted the ants 2 weeks ago. There was already a small dome in the foxberry bushes, made up of sticks and pine and fir needles. When the sun was shining, I saw a huge cluster of ants on the surface of this dome. The ants from E1 had given up the trail onto the birch tree, but they had a new trail leading inland, although I couldn't discover to what end. Ants from E2 had made even more progress with their new nest. They had occupied the stump where they were seen 2 weeks ago, and had already built quite a large dome over it, so that the stump could hardly be seen. They too had one trail leading to an unknown end. As you can see, my plans to look inside the nests were ruined. In a last attempt, I cut E2's new stump in half and put the glass against the remaining half as I did before. But in the future, my plan will once again fail to work. 10 days later, on the 11th of June, about 4 weeks after the resettlement, the situation in both E1 and E2 was much the same as before. Both nests had grown a bit bigger, and E2's trail had vanished. I offered both nests some dead wasps, but for some reason they didn't eat them. After a lengthy pause, I at last examined E1 and E2 again on the 7th of July, about 2 months after the resettlement. I discovered that both ant nests had moved again. This time E1 had favored a large stump about 5 meters inland from their last spot. The ants had built 2 domes, one on a jutting root and one right against the stump. But even as I watched, the ants were carrying pupae and larvae to another part of the stump. You can see a particularly strong and agile ant carrying 2 pupae at once. Soon they had abandoned the jutting root dome and were living all around the stump. They had 2 foraging trails leading onto fir trees. Things were not so well in E2. They too had moved out of their second ant nest and moved to another stump, closer to the original one. Already they had built a small dome, but there were very few ants on it, and when I offered them some dead flies, they ignored them. E2 had only one trail, leading to the foot of a large fir tree, where the ants were spotted 1 week after the resettlement. The ants were only scrabbling about the foot of the tree, not going on it, for some reason. Later the ants from E2 moved to this place under the tree altogether, but they still had no foraging trails. Their situation now looks pretty dire. Another 20 days later, on the 27th of July, to my slight surprise, both experimental nests were still alive. The ants from E1 had already built quite a large dome against part of the stump where they were carrying pupae to last time that I looked. They had only one foraging trail onto a medium-sized fir tree, but it was quite strong. I even saw some ants carrying caterpillars towards the nest. A few ants were doing something with pupae and larvae. They were taking them out of the nest and just bringing them back inside, but I couldn't discover why they were doing this. My chief source of surprise was E2. E2 ants had also built a dome under the fir tree where I had spotted them last. There were no foraging trails, but the ants were actively gathering building materials from the territory around their nest. To my great relief, I saw some ants carrying pupae on the surface of the nest. This suggests that E2 may survive after all. In the following week, E2 continued to amaze me. On the 5th of August, the ants moved back to their old ant nest in the stump, which they had built on the 1st of June and then abandoned. The nest looked much the worse for wear for the 2 months that it had been abandoned. It had sunk considerably and looked weather-beaten. Quite a few ants were now gathered on the surface of the nest. Some of them were carrying pupae or larvae. Still, some ants remained on their nest under the tree, but more and more kept moving to the old one. The next observation was on September the 21st, more than 4 months after the resettlement. It was quite cold, only 12 degrees Celsius, so there wasn't much activity on either of the experimental nests. No ants were visible on the surface of either of the domes of E2, although a few were spotted on the trunk of the tree under which one of the domes was located. A few ants, moving slowly, were seen on the surface of E1, but no rows were spotted. The last observation of E1 and E2 before the winter was carried out on October the 20th, 5 months after the resettlement. Same as the month before, no ants were visible on either of the domes of E2. There were also no ants on E1, and neither of the nests had any trails. But then again, huge nests like Twin were also inactive. I guess it's because it was already just too cold for the ants to go about, and they were already sleeping inside the nests. But I think I can say that both ant nests were still alive before the winter. We shall have to see if they are still alive in the spring. It is now July the 21st, more than a year since the resettlement of experimental nest 1 and 2. No ants can be seen on the surface of either of the nests. This may be due in part to the cold weather, almost 15 degrees Celsius, but it still seems that both nests have suffered badly during the winter. A couple of days beforehand, when it was a bit warmer, about 20 degrees, a small group of ants was seen on the surface of E2 and only 1 or 2 on the surface of E1. There are no clusters of ants and no foraging trails to speak of. I'll have to hope for the best, but it would seem that neither nest survived the resettlement. I will continue to passively monitor the ant nests on Iloranta Holiday Village, but the active part of my experiments is over. This is therefore my last video. I hope that if you watched them, you found them interesting and you learned some new things about ants.